So, our adventure today starts in a field. Now, I know that doesn't sound adventurous, but I want you to imagine that it's planted full of really tall corn plants that tower above your head. And the kind of field that if you walked only a few feet in, you'd feel like you were lost in the jungle. And that is where Jesus and his disciples were on the Sabbath, the day of rest. And they were hungry, so they picked some corn to eat. And this is where the story gets interesting, because the Pharisees, who were the religious elite of the time, were watching everything that they did. And they got very agitated by that simple action. Now, randomly, reading this story reminded me of adventures that the kids and I have had at Farmer Palmer's. Now, I don't know if they still have it, but they used to have a maze, a brilliant kind of lose yourself in kind of maze made out of corn plants. And we had such fun in there, but there was always one rule on a sign. It said, "Do not pick and eat the corn." But why? Well, in fairness, the sign did explain. The maize that they had used was field-grown corn for animal feed, and not the sweet corn that we know and love to eat as a vegetable, although they look very, very similar. So there was a reason behind the rule, which ultimately was for our best interests. Now, if you apply this to our story today, if you can imagine that there is one rule on a sign by this field, and it was given by God to Moses as part of the Ten Commandments. Remember the Sabbath and keep it holy. A simple rule, but over the years since it was handed down, it had been added to and expanded by people, so that it had become a very technical set of do's and don'ts. And it was one of these legal technicalities that the Pharisees were worked up about. By picking and eating the corn, they felt that the disciples were effectively harvesting the corn and thus working. So focused were they on this technicality that they either could not or chose not to consider the intent behind the rule, the feeling and motivation behind the letter. They had no room for compassion. Now, I don't really want to get into the meaning and intent of the Sabbath itself, but instead I want to focus on how Jesus justifies what the disciples did more generally. So Jesus said to the Pharisees, "If you had known what these words mean," and then he said, "I desire mercy, not sacrifice." He went on to say, "You would not have condemned the innocent." I desire mercy, not sacrifice. Now that's a curious statement, but one that would have smacked the Pharisees in the face, knowing the Old Testament as they did. You see, this isn't the first time these words appear in the Bible, and neither are they the first time that they are spoken by Jesus. And the implication behind them would have been clear to the Pharisees. See, these exact words or variations on it had been used to warn individuals or Israel as a whole to think about what they would, why they were doing something. What were the reason and motivation behind making that sacrifice, rather than just doing the sacrifice because it is the thing to do. Now, of course, God created the sacrificial system in the Old Testament, and also established things like the Lord's Supper and baptism in the New Testament. And these are important rituals that are designed to bring us closer to God, to remind us of Him and to strengthen that relationship. And Jesus is in no way saying that they are rubbish, but He does imply that doing these things are only meaningful if they are performed with an attitude of love and obedience. God wants us to love Him, trust Him, and turn from our sin. And the Pharisees were not doing that. They were self-reliant and self-important. They had created this elaborate and overbearing system of rules to enforce and complicate the simple Sabbath rule. And in doing so, they had lost the intent behind it. The sacrifice they were making in not working on the Sabbath was not rooted in love and obedience, but pride and self-righteousness. It is that kind of sacrifice that Jesus doesn't want. Instead, Jesus desires mercy. So let's explore that. Now, I love how casually Jesus walks in from the fields to the synagogue with the Pharisees raging at his heels, to teach everyone exactly what mercy looks like. Now, he said, if any of you has a sheep and it falls into a pit on the Sabbath, will you not take hold of it and lift it out? How much more valuable is a person than a sheep? Therefore, it is lawful to do good on the Sabbath. And then he went on to heal a man with a shriveled hand. Now, Jesus is always careful with his words, and I think it's interesting that he chose a word picture of a sheep which had fallen in a pit. The merciful and compassionate thing to do would be to lift it out, even if that meant working on the Sabbath. And that is exactly what Jesus came to do: lift his sheep, us, out of the pit of sin and separation from God, by being the ultimate and only sacrifice needed to ensure our forgiveness once and for all. He died for us so that we could receive mercy, forever saved from the punishment that we thoroughly deserve. But not only that, he went on to demonstrate mercy in a much more tangible way that we can look at as a model for how we can treat others in our own life. He healed the man's shriveled hand. He saw somebody who was in need and took compassionate action. He did something. And there are so many more examples in the Gospels when sick or demon-possessed people call out to Jesus as the merciful one and were then healed. Or times when Jesus had compassion on the crowd and so fed them or taught them. But what can we take from this? Well, firstly, I think we need to consider why we are doing certain things. Why are we coming to church? Why are we taking communion? Why are we giving money? And assess our own motivations. Is it in love and obedience to God? Is it an act of worship? Or is it to impress other people? Has it become an empty ritual? Because if it is the latter, then hopefully this should be the nudge you need to get your heart posture back in the right place. Secondly, we should model mercy like Jesus modeled mercy. He saw the needy, the lost, the poor, and the sick, and he did something. Active compassion. And I think if we can go forward as a church, as a collection of randomly wonderful people practicing active compassion, then we will see more people come to faith and be lifted out of the pit.